Hello, my name is Roxana Nazari. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the International Law Students Association. And in connection with our training videos, today we have with us Lucas Jones, who's a former participant in the Jessup competition. And today we're going to be discussing things I wish I had done differently before the memorial deadline. Lucas, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Roxana. I'm Lucas. I participated in the Jessup in 2025. My team were national finalists and we reached the international rounds. And our memorials were um, an interesting experience. So I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Great. So I know it's always easier to look back with hindsight and to think about things that you would have done differently. So what are some of the suggestions you would have for teams that are actively working on their memorials now?
Yeah, I think I have three sort of key areas that I'd focus on, and this is informed by my previous decision, by my previous experience. The first is keep in mind what other members of your team are doing. So with my team, we were all working separately. We kind of weren't checking in with each other, which sort of felt fine, and we all felt like we were progressing. And then we arrived the week before the memorial deadline and realized that everyone's memorials are in a completely different place. Obviously, the work has to be split up, otherwise it's untenable. But you need to make sure that everyone's kind of working together because at the end of the day, it has to be a really clear, uniform document in order to get those high marks. Speaking of marks, the second point that I wish I'd been more clear on is how important the memorials can be to a close moot. Even though they're not binding on your team, they are really important because your opposing team will go through them and will pick stuff out, which can put you on the back foot. But also, the judges will be looking at them, particularly in the international rounds, and it can make the difference in a very, very close moot. The third and final thing is so in the UK, where I'd done some mooting submissions are typically like 1 or 2 pages. They're a strict list of authorities that you have to stick to. In Jessup, it's completely different. The research is so, so vital for the written submissions and the oral submissions, and the memorials are so much longer. So I think when you're thinking about it strategically, you have to dedicate much more time to written submissions as a proportion of your overall preparation than you might do in a national round. But that obviously depends on where you're from and what kind of the culture of mooting is over there.
So how often did you meet with your team during the memorial phase? Did you really all work separately, or did you have yet some regular meetings as well?
So we were meeting really often, but we were focusing on the oral submissions. So our philosophy was essentially keep talking through it by doing or around moots. And that will sort of clarify what's going to happen with the memorials. In practice, as I've said, that didn't actually work very well because we were so ingrained in working out what we were going to say and finding our way through those arguments that actually the memorials ended up progressing sort of fairly separately, and we didn't carve out the time to actually talk about those properly. So we were meeting a lot, but not necessarily in the right way.
Okay. And did you encounter any formatting issues or any particular part? And I'll just refer everyone, we'll be speaking about official rule number 5, which is the one that governs memorials.
Yeah, so the formatting is those rules are a really, really important thing to look at early on because there's quite sort of idiosyncratic rules about, for example, which abbreviations you can use, which citations you have to use. You sort of have to pick out your format really early and stick to it. I think also that can help because the last day of the memorials ends up feeling like the most tedious because you're going through dotting every I, crossing every T, and making sure the formatting is all right. So I think, yeah, one of the challenges that I really didn't expect with the memorial is how confident you have to get with using all of Word's features in order to make it sort of compelling, uniform document, and at the same time keeping in mind all of the different rules that are binding you in terms of what you can actually submit.
And did you find it helpful to look at any of Ilsa's resources, such as the memorial score sheet or the penalty sheet for the memorials?
Yeah, definitely. So the two kind of key resources that we used, the first was the penalty sheet, um, which may seem slightly pessimistic, but it was really important to go through and just check everything against those penalties because it's not worth losing marks where you could have not lost marks. But the second thing that's really, really useful is that the Jessup publishes the Baxter winning memorials each year. And seeing how well a Jessup memorial can be done and kind of using that as a springboard for style, for structure, and for some of the basic arguments, I think was an incredibly helpful sort of guide, particularly if, like me, you haven't done an international moot before. It's great that there's like a clear example of how to do this really, really well published.
As the Jessup rules, particularly on the memorials, do change from year to year, were there any pitfalls that you had to watch out for when you were looking back at old examples of memorials?
Yes. So one of the key ones is it a compromise or is it a statement of agreed fact? That was a huge thing, which sounds ridiculous now that I say it, but it was a really big thing about so our year was a statement of agreed facts and not a compromise. And we hadn't fully understood that they're not synonyms, that there is kind of an actual difference. So I remember there was a moment where we realized that, and it was like the memorials change every single kind of thing of compromise this, compromise that. It wasn't a compromise. So you do have to be really careful about looking not only those previous examples, which are really useful, but also looking at what is actually in front of you and making sure that everything aligns with that and makes sense.
And you mentioned abbreviations before. Our rules on acronyms are a fairly new one. So did you have any particular challenges with that as well? No.
Yeah, I think my sort of tendency in my writing, particularly before I started with Jessup, was to really do just abbreviate anything that can be abbreviated in order to make sure that the writing is clear. And I think realizing that there were actually rules that pertain to the use of acronyms, how you can put them into your written submissions was just, it's just an additional thing to think about while you're writing. And if you don't check those early, I think it's one of the hardest things to actually deal with later down the line because you have this big list of acronyms that you can and can't use. And it's like, if you've done too much, how do you check against the two different lists to make sure that's all right? So yeah, that was quite a learning curve for me. But again, a useful thing to have once it was all sorted in the memorials.
And you mentioned also going through features of Microsoft Word. I know sometimes we have teams having issues with leaving track changes in their memorials. Were there any other particular features that you had issues with? No.
Um, yeah, so the track changes, I think I still have about 100 versions of the memorial, including my final one. I think one of the things that the really jumped out that I haven't used before is how you can create a document where you can use the table of contents to skip to different parts and ensure that all of the and this comes back as well to what I was saying about the team working separately, is that if you write it all out in one document, you can create a table of contents in Word that lays out neatly the progression of all your arguments. And I think that's really helpful, both for you referring back, but also for anyone using it. And that took a lot of wrestling to get all of the formatting the same. For the headings, for the different subsections, and also for the footnotes as well, just making everything look. I think the most difficult thing, honestly, from like a formatting perspective, was just making everything even and the same when it's all sort of been brought together. In my case, at quite a late stage in the proceedings.
So I know you've talked about working separately with your teammates on this. At what point did you actually merge everything into one document? And when would you maybe suggest for others listening to this, when would be a more ideal time to do that?
So we met the weekend before. I think maybe the weekend before, or the weekend second before, if that makes sense. The actual memorial deadline. And we sat in a room from 9 a.m. to about 6 p.m., just kind of going away at it. I would definitely not recommend that. I think you should be over the course of December, right, getting your memorials into shape as uniform documents, even if not all the content is there, even if there's still research to be done, even there's still arguments you're not sure of. Having that final document that you can work from eliminates so much of the extra stress in terms of the little things like the formatting, the abbreviations. Once you've mastered that and got on top of it, the content actually by the end of the research process I found was the easiest thing about the memorial. So definitely much earlier is what I'd say. I'd say it's probably a good idea before if you have a break over the season to just sort of have a loose draft ready just before the Christmas break, and then you can come back a bit more revitalized in the new year and give it a final read and then have it ready to be submitted.
And in terms of the actual submission, how much before the submission deadline did you actually upload that on the ILSA portal?
So I'm glad you asked that. Applicant Memorial went in a day before. The Respondent Memorial, I'm convinced we were the last team to load it because I remember being on the phone to one of the other members of my team as we were uploading the respondent memorial at 10:59 and the deadline was 11. So genuinely it was like really down to the wire. And I can't stress enough that this is not what I recommend. And part of the reason I wanted to do this is like learn from my mistakes so you don't have to learn from yours in a sense. But yeah, it was really down to the wire, but we did get there in the end and we did get them in, which was great.
And I'd also just like to remind anybody watching that the deadline is 5 p.m. U.S. Central Time, so you have to make sure that you calculate that in your own time
Yeah.
zone, so that there aren't any also mix-ups with respect to that.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I would say don't look at the deadline and then pretend the deadline is a day or two before and work like that because it was so it's just not a fun way to spend the final day kind of getting everything ready at that period. So yeah, definitely check the timings, but I'd say almost like give yourself your own deadline that's a day or two before that you're actually working towards.
That sounds like good advice.
Mm.
Are there any other thoughts or suggestions you would have to teams working on the memorials now?
Um, the only I mean the last thing I'd say is sort of don't silo the process of writing the memorials and thinking about your oral submissions. I think it's so important to do all the research now so you've got it in your arsenal when you're doing the oral submissions. It helps you work out what the strongest arguments are, helps you answer judicial interventions is something that I found really useful about the memorial research because you have at your fingertips the end of the process, this huge bank of resources that you've read. So I think that's the sort of last thing. It can seem like very separate activities, you're writing and you're speaking. Actually, the best way to do it, in my view, is to really integrate those two while you're doing your preparation because it helps both sides.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucas. I hope this will be very helpful to teams that are very busy right now on the memorials, and we wish everyone good luck.
Me too. Yeah, good luck, guys.